It was the kind of southern night that wrapped the world in heat and silence. The air was thick with the smell of pine and distant asphalt, and the only sound along Highway 41 was the hum of passing trucks fading into the dark. Around 8:15 p.m., Derek and Alyssa Cain pulled into the Silver Pines Motel, a roadside stop halfway between Birmingham and the Tennessee line. Their 2-year-old daughter, Alyssa, had fallen asleep in her car seat hours ago, her tiny hand still clutching a worn, pink stuffed rabbit. They'd been on the road since morning, heading west to visit family in Texas, and the long drive had frayed every nerve. The Silver Pines was one of those motels that had seen better decades, a faded blue sign, chipped paint, and a playground with a single rusted swing set and a cracked slide. But to a young family exhausted from travel, it looked peaceful enough. Derek checked them in at the front desk while Melissa carried Alyssa inside, whispering lullabies under her breath. Room 12 smelled faintly of old carpet cleaner and cigarette smoke. Still, it was a place to rest. After unloading their bags, Derek decided to grab a few things from the car. Melissa, wanting to let Alyssa burn off some energy before bed, led her outside toward the playground. The motel's porch lights buzzed with moths, casting halos of gold against the darkening sky. Melissa watched as her daughter's small frame waddled across the gravel, her laughter soft and high-pitched, mixing with the hum of summer insects. For a moment, it was ordinary, comforting, even. Alyssa climbed onto the swing and called for her mother to push her. Melissa smiled, walked closer, and gave the seat a gentle nudge. The swing creaked rhythmically, slicing through the heavy evening air. She thought about how quickly their daughter was growing, how one day soon these tiny moments would just be memories. Then the motel door shut somewhere behind her. A car door slammed. Someone laughed from the parking lot. Melissa turned for half a second to glance toward the noise. When she looked back, the swing was empty. It still moved, faintly, back and forth. At first, she didn't panic. She scanned the edge of the playground, expecting to see Alyssa crouched behind the slide or chasing a frog into the grass. But the longer she looked, the quieter everything felt. The insects, the hum of the highway, it all seemed to fade. "Alyssa?" she called out. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. When there was no answer, she ran toward the swing, heart pounding, eyes darting from the road to the parking lot to the tree line. She called again, louder, then louder still. Within seconds, panic took hold. Her voice became frantic, pulling Derek out of the room in confusion. He found her kneeling in the dirt, scanning the shadows. "She was just right here," she kept saying. I looked away for 1 second. Within minutes, motel guests joined in. Flashlights swept through the dark as strangers combed the grounds, calling her name. Someone ran to the office to call 911. Derek sprinted from room to room, pounding on doors, demanding if anyone had seen a little girl. The night erupted into chaos, a mother screaming into the dark, the sound of gravel crunching under running feet, and the echo of her daughter's name carried off by the wind. When sheriff's deputies arrived just after 9 p.m., they found Melissa sitting near the swing set, trembling. Her hands were covered in dirt from where she'd clawed through the bushes herself. Derek stood nearby, pale, pacing in circles, muttering something about how impossible it was. Officers spread out in every direction, flashlights cutting through the dark. The motel's security cameras were old, grainy, black and white units mounted under the eaves. None faced the playground directly. The manager, a heavy-set man named Carl, admitted one had been broken for months. Deputies checked the footage anyway. What they found showed Melissa and Alyssa walking toward the playground. Then, nothing. No one else. No movement in the frame. For the first few hours, they treated it like a possible abduction. They searched the property, nearby roads, and drainage ditches. A K-9 unit arrived around midnight, the dogs sniffing at Alyssa's discarded toy near the swings. For a brief moment, they caught a faint scent that led toward the rear fence, but it vanished beyond the gravel lot. No tire marks, no footprints, nothing to suggest someone had carried her off. Deputies questioned guests one by one. Most were long-haul drivers or families just passing through. None recalled seeing a stranger near the playground. One woman mentioned hearing a car peel out around 8:30, but she hadn't seen which direction it went. Another said she thought she'd heard a child cry earlier, but she couldn't tell if it was from the playground or another room. By 2 a.m., the sheriff himself was on site, overseeing the search. The air had cooled, the fog rolling low across the asphalt. Melissa refused to go inside. She sat on the curb, wrapped in a motel blanket, her eyes locked on that empty swing. Derek hovered nearby, answering every question, his voice breaking each time he repeated the same details. The longer the night dragged on, the more confusing the timeline became. Derek swore he'd only been gone for 5, maybe 10 minutes while unloading the trunk. Melissa thought it was less. But witnesses said they saw him walking back from the vending machine across the lot almost 20 minutes later. The discrepancy seemed small until investigators realized those minutes were the entire window in which Alyssa disappeared. By sunrise, the Silver Pines was cordoned off with yellow tape. Reporters began to arrive, and the story spread fast. 2-year-old vanishes from Alabama motel playground. Local volunteers searched the woods. Helicopters scanned the area. But after 24 hours, not a single piece of clothing, no trail, no evidence of a struggle turned up. Inside the motel office, deputies stared at a whiteboard covered in timelines and theories. Stranger abduction, parental involvement, animal attack. Nothing fit cleanly. A child doesn't simply disappear into thin air, not from a lit playground beside a busy highway. Yet here they were. That night, as the motel emptied of guests and the swing sat still under the buzzing light, Melissa lay on the bed in their taped-off room, staring at Alyssa's stuffed rabbit on the nightstand. Derek sat in silence by the door, his head in his hands. Neither spoke. Outside, deputies paced, waiting for a lead that never came. And just before dawn, when the search teams pulled back to regroup, one of the officers paused near the playground. The gravel had been disturbed in places from all the foot traffic, but there, just behind the fence, he noticed something strange. A tiny shoe print, smaller than his palm, pressed into the dirt, facing the woods. It ended there. No trail leading away. No second step. It was as if Alyssa Cain had taken one step into the dark and simply ceased to exist. The search for Alyssa Cain began before the sun had even risen over northern Alabama. Dozens of deputies and volunteers fanned out through the dense pine woods behind the Silver Pines Motel, calling her name through the morning fog. They checked drainage ditches, culverts, the nearby creek bed, anywhere a child might have wandered. The scent dogs led their handlers in wide, looping circles that always came back to the same spot. The playground. It was as if she'd vanished into air just beyond the swing set. By mid-morning, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office had set up a temporary command post in the motel's parking lot. Detectives from surrounding counties arrived to help, and state investigators were called in. Helicopters swept the area, and roadblocks went up in both directions along Highway 41. But by that afternoon, there was still no trace, no shoe, no toy, no clothing, just silence. The motel owner, a man in his late 50s named Carl Jennings, told officers that he'd heard the Cains arguing earlier that evening, before the disappearance. He said their fight had been loud enough that one of the guests complained. According to him, the father, Derek, had stormed out to the parking lot while the mother stayed in the room with the child. That detail didn't fit Melissa's version of events, but investigators noted it. Every timeline, every movement mattered. Detectives separated the couple for questioning that afternoon. Melissa was distraught, shaking, crying, answering every question between sobs. But as the hours dragged on, her emotions shifted. She grew quiet, almost detached, her eyes vacant as if she had run out of tears. Some investigators later recalled how her tone unnerved them. She wasn't angry, She wasn't pleading. She was simply calm. Derek, on the other hand, was restless and defensive. He swore he'd only left to get ice from the vending machine on the far side of the lot. But when officers checked the motel's front office records, the clerk remembered seeing him closer to 8:40 p.m., almost 15 minutes later than he claimed. When asked where he'd been during that gap, Derek couldn't give a clear answer. "I don't know," he said. "It's all a blur." Detectives began to wonder if the Cains knew more than they were saying. The motel property was searched again, this time with cadaver dogs. Around midnight on the second night, one of the dogs alerted near the large dumpster behind the maintenance shed. The scene was sealed off, floodlights illuminating the area as technicians sifted through the trash. But after hours of searching, no remains were found. The dog's hit could have been from food waste, old meat, or something long decomposed. Still, it left everyone uneasy. As the investigation widened, a man who lived half a mile down the road contacted police. He said he'd seen a white sedan speeding away from the motel around 8:30 that night. He couldn't make out the plate, but the image stuck with him, the car's headlights cutting through the fog, accelerating hard as if someone was fleeing. Detectives canvassed local garages and nearby towns for vehicles matching that description. They checked missing or stolen car reports. Nothing came up. Meanwhile, the story exploded in the media. Local news stations ran live coverage from outside the motel for days. Reporters described the case as one of Alabama's most baffling child disappearances. National outlets picked it up next, showing Alyssa's photograph, a small, smiling toddler with curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes. Flyers appeared in gas stations and grocery stores across 3 states. The pressure on investigators was immense, but the more attention the case received, the more theories began to spread. Talk radio. Hosts speculated about a child trafficking ring that used rural motels as pickup points. Online forums circulated grainy, unrelated photos of white sedans, claiming they matched witness descriptions. Some said Melissa had sold her daughter. Others accused Derek of covering up an accident. Detectives followed every lead they could. They interviewed sex offenders in the area, checked for travelers who had stayed at the motel that week, and ran forensic tests on every inch of room 12. But there was nothing, no fingerprints out of place, no DNA that didn't belong to the family, no evidence of forced entry or blood. As the weeks turned into months, frustration built inside the task force. The sheriff's department brought in the FBI for behavioral analysis. Their report was grim. Based on inconsistencies in the parents' statements and lack of evidence of an outside abductor, the profilers believed Alyssa's disappearance was most likely the result of a domestic incident concealed as a missing persons case. It wasn't a formal accusation, but it shifted the tone of the entire investigation. Behind closed doors, detectives began to dig deeper into the couple's background. They learned that Derek had a history of gambling debt and had recently lost his job as a mechanic. Melissa, according to her sister, had been threatening to leave him. Family members described their marriage as volatile, though neither had a criminal record. To the public, they were simply heartbroken parents. To investigators, they were becoming suspects without evidence. The couple's behavior in the weeks after the disappearance only made things more complicated. Melissa avoided the press and refused to participate in televised pleas for information. Derek gave one interview on local TV, but his detached tone angered viewers. Public sympathy began to fade, replaced by suspicion. By the fall of 2003, search efforts had scaled back. The command post was gone. Volunteers stopped coming. The Silver Pines Motel reopened for business, though most travelers avoided it after hearing the story. The Cains eventually left Alabama and returned to Tennessee, living in quiet isolation. For the detectives still assigned to the case, hope dwindled. Every lead led nowhere. A truck driver claimed to have seen a little girl, matching Alyssa's description at a rest stop near Memphis, but surveillance proved it was another child. Another tip came from a woman in Louisiana who swore she'd seen Melissa at a gas station with a different child, but the timestamp made it impossible. Each call raised hope, then crushed it. By late 2004, the task force had nothing left to pursue. With no body, no confession, and no physical evidence, prosecutors couldn't bring charges against anyone. The sheriff reluctantly reclassified the case as inactive. It was filed away with the others that might never be solved. Years passed. The Silver Pines Motel slowly fell apart. Guests stopped, coming all together after a series of break-ins and local rumors that the property was haunted. The swing set rusted, its chains hanging loose. Grass grew high around the slide where Alyssa had last been seen. The blue neon sign flickered out one letter at a time until only Silver Pine remained, dim against the night sky. For those who had been there, the deputies, the volunteers, the parents, it became a wound that never healed. Every anniversary brought a brief mention on the news, a reminder of the little girl who vanished without a sound. And though the case had gone cold, one detective kept the original file in her desk drawer. Sometimes she'd open it late at night and stare at the photo of Alyssa smiling in her pink overalls, wondering if the truth was buried somewhere in those woods or inside the people who had stood closest to her when she disappeared. No one knew then that the answer wouldn't come for another 22 years. By the time 2020 arrived, the Silver Pines Motel was little more than a memory rotting in the Alabama humidity. The parking lot was split by weeds. Windows were boarded shut. The once bright blue sign that had flickered for decades now leaned on one bent pole, its paint stripped to dull metal. Locals said the place felt cursed, a ghost story passed from one generation to the next. But for retired detective Marla Jennings, it wasn't just a story. It was the case that never left her. She'd been 29 when she joined the original search for Alyssa Cain back in 2003, one of the youngest detectives on the team, and one of the last to still think about that empty swing behind the motel. The night Alyssa vanished had marked the start of Marla's career. It was also the case that taught her what failure really felt like. Even after retirement, she kept the file box in her basement, newspaper clippings, photographs, the mother's 911 call on a worn cassette tape. 2 decades later, she still couldn't listen to that tape without picturing the panic in Melissa's voice. In early 2020, when she saw a small online post about forgotten missing persons in Alabama, something stirred. True crime forums had rediscovered the Silver Pines case. Threads titled, "What Really Happened to Alyssa Cain?" spread fast, thousands of comments from amateur sleuths, dissecting every detail, every rumor. Some accused the parents. Others believed in a stranger abduction. But most just called it what it was, a mystery that had never made sense. Marla clicked through the comments for hours. It was unsettling, watching strangers piece apart the same case she had spent years trying to hold together. But one post caught her attention, a user claiming new DNA testing technology could retrieve usable samples from degraded evidence. The comment mentioned a case in Georgia solved through similar means. That night, Marla couldn't sleep. She went into her basement, opened the old file box, and stared at the photos from 2003. The swing set, the gravel, the tiny shoe recovered from behind the fence. It had been logged as too degraded for testing. She remembered the day she held it in her hands, a pink toddler sneaker, half covered in mud, found near the property line. They had assumed it was Alyssa's. But the lab back then couldn't extract anything. Now she wondered if that had changed. She called the county evidence storage facility the next morning. To her surprise, the box still existed. The chain of custody had held. Within weeks, with permission from the sheriff's department, that shoe was sent to a modern forensic lab specializing in low-yield DNA recovery. While the tests were underway, Marla tried to reach the Cains. She hadn't spoken to either parent in nearly 15 years. Melissa lived quietly in eastern Tennessee, in a modest apartment above a used clothing store where she worked part-time. Her walls were bare except for one framed photograph, Alyssa, smiling in a pink jacket. People who knew her said she rarely mentioned the past. Her neighbors described her as polite, reserved, but distant. When Marla called, Melissa hesitated before agreeing to meet. In person, her hair had turned gray early, her voice soft but guarded. She still swore she hadn't taken her eyes off the swing for more than a few seconds that night. But she also admitted something she'd never told police, that Derek had been gone longer than he said. When asked how long, she stared out the window for a moment before saying, "Long enough." Derek, now remarried and living in Florida, was harder to reach. He'd built a new life, managing an auto repair shop. When reporters occasionally called about the old case, he refused to talk. But when Marla left a message explaining that new forensic work was being done, he returned the call himself. His voice was tense. He claimed Melissa had always been unstable, that she'd once threatened to leave, with Alyssa. He insisted he had nothing to hide, that he'd cooperated with police fully back then. When Marla brought up the polygraph results, his tone changed. "Those tests mean nothing," he said sharply. They told her I failed too. He was right. Both parents had failed portions of their polygraphs in 2003, though the results were deemed inconclusive due to emotional distress. Still, those inconsistencies had haunted the case ever since. To Marla, it had always felt like there was a missing piece between their two stories, a gap no one could fill. As the weeks passed, the forensic lab continued its work. The scientists used advanced mitochondrial DNA extraction on what little residue remained inside the fabric of the small shoe. It took months of analysis, reamplification, and comparison with the original parental DNA samples still on file. Then, late one afternoon in July, Marla received the call that stopped her cold. The DNA inside the shoe did not match either, Derek or Alyssa Cain. At first, she thought it had to be contamination, a clerical mistake, but the lab confirmed it twice. The profile belonged to an unknown female adult, not the child. That detail changed everything. The shoe, long assumed to have been Alyssa's, had belonged to someone else entirely. Marla revisited the crime scene photographs again. The shoe had been found 30 feet beyond the motel's fence, near the service lane that led to the maintenance shed. No one had lived in that area, but during the early 2000s, the motel employed 2 maintenance workers who often dumped trash and scrap behind that fence. One of them was listed in the original report, Eli Morrows. The name struck a faint memory. She pulled the old personnel record from the evidence binder. The Morrows family had owned the motel at the time, Gerald and Diane, an older couple who ran it for nearly a decade before selling in 2006. Their son Eli had been around 20 back then. He'd done repairs, landscaping, odd jobs. And right after Alyssa's disappearance, he'd abruptly quit. It wasn't unusual at the time. Several employees had left after the motel's reputation collapsed. But in light of the new DNA, the details seemed too sharp to ignore. Marla tried to locate him. Property records showed an address in Mississippi, but no recent activity. She wondered if the woman's DNA from the shoe could have been Diane's, the mother, someone who might have handled evidence or even helped move something that night. The lab couldn't say for sure. But what was certain was this: the shoe didn't belong to Alyssa, and it had been found in the exact area where cadaver dogs had hit near the dumpster 17 years earlier. For Marla, it felt like the case had just reopened itself. When she returned to the Silver Pines property that fall, it was nearly swallowed by vines. The air was still and heavy. She walked to where the playground used to stand, only a patch of dirt and twisted metal left. She could almost hear echoes of the searchers calling Alyssa's name all those years ago. The motel had been sold at least twice since the disappearance, but no one ever managed to keep it running. Locals claimed it was bad luck. Others said it was haunted by that little girl. Standing there, Marla didn't believe in curses. She believed in evidence. And now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, there was something new, something real. She sent a formal request to the state's cold case division to reopen the file, citing newly verified DNA findings. Within a month, the request was approved. Investigators began re-examining old witness statements, property maps, and employee rosters. That winter, a state crime scene team returned to Silver Pines for a ground scan of the property. It was mostly routine until one technician flagged an area near the old maintenance shed where the soil pattern looked disturbed. They marked it for excavation in the coming months. Marla stood quietly on the edge of the lot as the sun went down, the light stretching across the cracked pavement. It had been 22 years since a young mother looked away from a swing for just a few seconds, and though no one knew it yet, the truth buried beneath that motel was finally about to come to light. Every case we cover takes weeks of research, real records, and late nights uncovering the truth behind forgotten lives. We do it because these stories matter. Every victim deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep revealing the truth, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case stayed with you. For more mysterious, solved cold cases, check the links in the description below. The excavation at the Silver Pines Motel began quietly, almost cautiously, under a gray Alabama sky in early spring of 2021. For years, the property had sat abandoned, tangled in vines and silence, its cracked pavement littered with glass and pine needles. Now, yellow tape cordoned off the lot once again, just as it had nearly 2 decades earlier. But this time, something was different. There was purpose in the air. The county sheriff's department, joined by forensic teams from the state, moved in with ground-penetrating radar equipment. Retired Detective Marla Jennings stood at the edge of the property, watching as the machines traced careful lines across the earth. It felt almost surreal. For 22 years, she'd imagined what might lie beneath that ground. Now, for the first time, she was about to find out. The scans took hours. Technicians moved in measured sweeps, pausing to flag anomalies in the soil places where the earth density didn't match the surrounding terrain. Near the rear of the property, behind what had once been the maintenance shed, one of the machines began showing irregular readings. The soil there had been disturbed at some point in the past. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to justify digging. By mid-afternoon, the first shovel broke through the earth. The air was heavy with humidity, and the sound of cicadas filled the gaps between each scoop of dirt. Within an hour, the excavation team uncovered a shallow depression just a few feet deep, but distinct. Inside it, fragments of fabric were visible, clumped together with mud. They stopped immediately and called in the forensic anthropologists. What they found next stopped everyone cold. Tiny bone fragments, porous, fragile, human. They were scattered and incomplete, mixed with degraded clothing fibers that forensic analysts later identified as part of a small child's outfit brands popular in the early 2000s. It wasn't enough to confirm an identity, but the implication was impossible to ignore. The discovery reignited everything. Within 24 hours, national media outlets descended on Jefferson County. Satellite vans lined the road outside the motel gates, reporters delivering live updates about the potential remains found at the site of the Silver Pines disappearance. The story that had once been a local tragedy was suddenly national again. And for the first time in years, the name Alyssa Cain was back on television screens across the country. Melissa saw the news on her phone. She hadn't been contacted yet by police, but within hours, journalists were at her door. At first, she refused to speak. But as the coverage grew, she agreed to one interview with a local station out of Birmingham. It aired the next day, an emotional, trembling appearance where she sat on a small couch, clutching a framed photo of Alyssa from 2003. Her voice shook as she spoke. She said she'd always known her daughter didn't wander off, that someone had taken her. And then, mid-sentence, she said something that froze viewers. "Someone took my baby and buried her there." No official confirmation had yet been released about human remains. The words spread fast, replayed on every channel, and analyzed by online commentators. Some said it was just a mother's intuition after decades of grief. Others thought it sounded like something else, knowledge she shouldn't have had. Within days, police reopened the case in full, treating the discovery as a potential homicide. They traced back ownership of the motel during the time of Alyssa's disappearance. The property records led them to Gerald and Diane Morrows, an older couple who had run Silver Pines for most of the late 1992s and early 2000s. A deeper background check revealed what few had known back then. Both had prior arrests for child neglect and endangerment in another county years earlier. They'd quietly settled fines and reopened the business under a new name. Investigators found that during the 2003 search, Gerald and Diane had been questioned briefly but dismissed. They'd seemed cooperative and unremarkable at the time. They claimed to have been inside their living quarters watching television the night Alyssa vanished. No one had checked beyond that. Now, those details took on a much darker weight. Detectives started digging into the motel's employee logs from that period. Most records had been discarded when the property changed hands, but a few surviving pages surfaced in county archives. That's when they found a name that immediately caught their attention: Eli Morrows. Listed as maintenance. Hired in 2002. No listed termination date. When investigators cross-checked tax and employment filings, Eli's paper trail ended abruptly in late 2003, around the same time the Cain case went cold. There were no subsequent employment records, no forwarding address, and no trace of him in state or federal systems under that name. It was as if he'd disappeared right alongside the little girl. Marla remembered Eli. He'd been quiet, almost forgettable, a lanky young man who rarely looked anyone in the eye. He'd helped with the search that first night, walking, with the volunteers carrying flashlights. Back then, no one thought twice about him. He was just the handyman. Now, 2 decades later, his absence spoke volumes. The sheriff's office began reaching out to anyone still alive who had worked at the motel during that time. One former desk clerk recalled Eli as odd but polite, someone who didn't talk much and sometimes slept in his truck. Another said he always seemed nervous around children. When asked if they remembered anything unusual in the weeks after the disappearance, one maintenance subcontractor mentioned seeing Gerald and Eli working behind the shed late one evening, burning trash. He remembered it because the sheriff's department had already been investigating at the time. Forensic specialists returned to the excavation site over the following days. They expanded the search perimeter and found more fragments, not just bone, but pieces of metal hardware, part of a toy clasp, and a small button from what might have been a child's jacket. The remnants of a plastic tag bore faded letters from a clothing brand last sold in stores around 2002. Each discovery added weight to a story that could no longer be ignored. DNA analysis began immediately, though the process was slow. Degradation, contamination, and years of exposure made extraction difficult, but the team was optimistic. The mitochondrial sequencing that had succeeded on the shoe months earlier could now be applied to these new remains. Meanwhile, the press turned relentless. News outlets speculated about possible arrests. Online forums exploded with theories. Some pointed again to Derek and Melissa, noting how her interview phrasing seemed incriminating. Others focused on the Morrows family, especially the missing son. The motel became a true crime pilgrimage site overnight, with locals sneaking through the fence to take photos of the dig. Melissa refused to speak again. Derek, tracked down in Florida, released a short statement, saying he was grateful for renewed efforts to find the truth. But privately, according to people close to him, he was furious at how Melissa had spoken on television. He told friends he believed she'd given herself away. As the weeks passed, the pressure on the sheriff's office mounted. Everyone wanted to know whose bones were buried at Silver Pines. Then, late in the summer, the forensic team made a critical breakthrough. Among the fragments, one bone, a small piece of the humerus, contained a recoverable sample of mitochondrial DNA. It was sent for comparison against the DNA reference from Alyssa Cain, still on file from 2003. The results took 8 weeks. When they finally arrived, they stunned everyone involved. The remains found behind the motel were consistent with being from a child of Alyssa's maternal line. Statistically, the odds of error were near zero. It was her. The confirmation sent shockwaves across the state. For nearly 22 years, the case had lingered in speculation and rumor. Now, the truth had a body, one that had been hidden just a few yards behind where searchers had stood in 2003. But the investigation didn't stop there. Detectives pressed deeper into the Morrow's family history, trying to find out what had happened to Eli. The trail led them to Mississippi, where property records showed an Eli G. Morrow's, purchasing land under a slightly altered name. He'd been living there quietly for years, off-grid, with a new identity. When investigators visited the property, they found him gone. The house was empty, the mailbox overflowing, signs of a quick departure. But inside, they found something chilling. Old motel ledgers, yellowed photographs of Silver Pines, and a work ID badge with a date stamp of June 2003. The discovery pointed to one undeniable fact. Someone connected to that motel had known exactly what happened to Alyssa Cain. And whoever that was had managed to keep it buried until now. The DNA results came back in the spring of 2022, and for investigators, it was the kind of breakthrough they'd been chasing for decades. After months of analysis, forensic genealogists traced the partial profile recovered from the bone fragments to a narrow family line, one that matched the Morrow's surname. The odds of coincidence were microscopic. Every data point, every cross-reference, every ancestral marker led back to one person, Eli Gerald Morrows, the former maintenance worker at the Silver Pines Motel, who had vanished from records just after Alyssa Cain disappeared. It took weeks to find him. He had changed his name in 2005, living quietly in a rural part of Mississippi under the alias Eli Garner. Public records showed nothing criminal, just odd jobs, a modest trailer on the outskirts of a small town, and a single speeding ticket from years earlier. He wasn't hiding from law enforcement, not exactly. He had simply erased the version of himself that existed back in 2003, when Alabama detectives arrived to question him. Eli didn't resist. He looked older than his years, thin, weathered, gray at the temples. He agreed to talk, though at first he claimed to remember little about the case. He said he'd heard about that missing girl back when he worked at the motel, but insisted he knew nothing more. His story was neat, careful, and rehearsed. But when detectives brought up the DNA link, the change in his expression was immediate. His eyes dropped to the floor, his breathing quickened. He didn't ask how they found him, just whether his parents were still alive. Over the next 2 interviews, the truth emerged in fragments, each one heavier than the last. Eli eventually broke. The story he told was simple, but devastating. It had been an accident. According to him, on the night of June 17, 2003, he'd been driving an old maintenance truck behind the motel, hauling trash and scrap from a plumbing repair earlier that day. It was dark, and the back lot had no lights. He said he saw movement by the fence, a small figure that darted across his path, and before he could react, he hit something. The impact was light, like a bump. He thought it was debris. But when he got out, he saw her. Alyssa was lying near the gravel, motionless. He said he panicked. He didn't know what to do. He ran to get his father, Gerald, who was inside the office. By the time they returned, it was too late. She wasn't breathing. Gerald told him to stay quiet, that they couldn't call the police because Eli already had trouble on his record, a sealed juvenile case from when he was 16. If the authorities found out, his father said, he'd go to prison for life. So they made a decision that night, a choice that would destroy more than one family. Gerald and Diane helped Eli wrap the body in a maintenance tarp. They carried her behind the shed, where the ground was soft from recent rain, and dug a shallow pit. He said they didn't mean for it to be permanent. They told themselves they'd move her later, that they just needed to protect him until things blew over. But the search at the motel began within an hour, and they realized it was already too late. The next morning, when detectives arrived, Eli joined the volunteers, pretending to help. He said he'd planned to confess years later, after his parents were gone, but Diane had begged him not to. She said it would ruin everything, that no one would believe it was an accident after so long. She told me it would bring the devil to our door, he said quietly during his statement. Investigators listened in silence. For 22 years, people had speculated about kidnappings, about strangers on the highway, about parents turning on each other. The truth was simpler, more human, and infinitely more tragic. A moment of carelessness, followed by 2 decades of fear and denial. When detectives asked why he hadn't at least moved Alyssa's remains or marked the spot, Eli said he'd gone back many times over the years. "I couldn't dig there again," he whispered. "It felt like she was still there, watching me." Authorities verified what they could. The old maintenance truck had indeed been part of the property's records in 2003. A partial VIN number found on one surviving invoice matched the vehicle he described. Forensic analysts found faint traces of paint and rust residue on one of the bone fragments recovered from the burial site, consistent with the undercarriage coating used on that same make of truck. Every detail, every physical piece of evidence lined up. When detectives confronted Diane Morrows, now 84 and living in a nursing home outside Montgomery, she refused to comment. She denied ever hearing about the burial, but her responses were evasive. She told one officer that her husband handled things back then and that it was ancient history. Gerald had died in 2012. Whatever secrets he carried had gone with him. Eli's confession was enough to close the case officially, but not emotionally. When the story broke publicly, it tore through the community. For over 2 decades, the Cain family had lived under the shadow of suspicion, neighbors whispering, reporters speculating, strangers dissecting their pain online. Now, the truth was out, but it didn't bring peace. Melissa watched the news coverage from her apartment in Tennessee. A reporter's voice narrated over footage of the motel being demolished. The segment showed a photograph of Eli, his face hollow, expression blank. She didn't cry. She just sat there, still, the sound low, her hands trembling slightly as if the world had stopped moving. For years, she'd pictured monsters taking her child away into the night. She never imagined that the man who buried her had once lived just yards away, under the same roof where they'd spent that terrible night searching. When detectives asked if she wanted to meet Eli, she refused. Derek, on the other hand, agreed. In a recorded meeting months later, he sat across from the man who'd kept his family's life in limbo for 22 years. Eli didn't look at him. He apologized quietly, saying he hadn't meant for any of it to happen. Derek didn't respond. He just stared for a long time, then walked out. Public reaction was divided. Some saw Eli's actions as cowardice, others as a tragic mistake buried by a family consumed with fear. But for those who had searched that night, the volunteers, the deputies, the town, it was devastating. The truth had finally arrived, but it came without redemption. Eli was charged with involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. The sentencing was brief. The court acknowledged his age and his cooperation, but the gravity of what had been lost hung over every word. When the verdict was read, he didn't look up. The small town of Silver Pines, once just a quiet stop off Highway 41, became a landmark of sorrow. The motel was torn down soon after, leaving behind an empty lot surrounded by pine trees. Locals said that on still nights, you could hear the faint swing of a chain in the wind where the playground used to be, though most dismissed it as imagination. For the Cain family, closure was a word that didn't fit. It wasn't closure, it was confirmation of a nightmare that had never ended. In the end, the truth came out not through miracles or confessions, but through science. Tiny strands of DNA that refused to stay buried. It connected a forgotten piece of a child's bone to the hands that had put her in the ground. And when it did, it forced everyone to face a devastating reality. Sometimes the answers we've waited a lifetime for don't set us free. They just show us how deep the silence truly went. And though the case was finally over on paper, for the people who had lived it, for Melissa, for Derek, for a small town haunted by one night in June 2003, it would never really be over. The trial began in February of 2025, nearly 22 years after the night that changed everything. The courthouse in Jefferson County was small, the kind of place more accustomed to minor thefts and property disputes than a case that had haunted an entire generation. Yet on that first morning, every seat was filled. Reporters lined the walls, victims' advocates and retired officers crowded the benches, and in the front row sat Derek and Alyssa Cain side by side for the first time in more than a decade. At the defense table, Eli Morrows looked smaller than anyone expected. 60 now, thin and pale. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the collar of his wrinkled shirt. The years had hollowed him out, leaving only the faint shape of the young man who once worked at the Silver Pines Motel. But the weight of what he'd carried all those years was visible in every line on his face. The charges were clear but narrowly defined: involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. There would be no debate over whether Alyssa Cain had died that night, only how, and why it had been hidden for so long. The prosecution's opening statement set the tone. It wasn't dramatic, just devastatingly simple. The district attorney described the night Alyssa vanished, the frantic search, and how a terrified young man's panic had spiraled into a lifetime of lies. The courtroom listened in silence as the DA spoke of the Cains, how two grieving parents had been forced to live under suspicion for 20 years while the truth sat buried behind a motel shed. Melissa sat still through most of it, her eyes fixed forward. Derek's hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. When the prosecutor turned to point at the defendant, describing how Eli and his parents had buried not only a body but a family's future, a low murmur ran through the room. When it was Eli's turn to speak through his attorney, the tone shifted. His defense admitted the act, the accidental death, but argued that fear and parental control had guided his every move afterward. They described him as a young man ruled by his domineering father, someone who made a terrible mistake and spent a lifetime regretting it. It was a legal strategy built on remorse, but for the Cains, it only made the silence of those years feel even colder. Over the next week, the jury heard the story unfold in precise, painful detail. Witnesses from the original investigation were called. Retired Detective Marla Jennings took the stand, explaining how the DNA breakthroughs had finally connected the fragments to Eli's family. She described the moment she heard his confession, the way his voice had cracked when he admitted what he'd done, the way he said, "I went back, and she was just lying there." The prosecution then played the audio from the 2003911 call. The sound of Melissa's voice filled the courtroom raw, broken, pleading for someone to help her, find her child. Even after 2 decades, the anguish was unbearable. A few jurors wept openly. Melissa covered her face with her hands. Derek stared at the floor, unmoving. Through testimony, the missing details finally came together like pieces of a terrible puzzle. Alyssa, curious and restless as toddlers often are, had seen a stray cat wander behind the fence that separated the motel lot from the maintenance area. She had slipped away while Melissa's back was turned. At that same moment, Eli was reversing the motel's old maintenance truck, its rear lights dim and half covered in dirt. He never saw her. The impact was small. She didn't even cry. He thought he'd hit a rock until he stepped out and saw her lying there. The panic came instantly. Fear of what would happen. Fear of his father's rage. Fear of the police. He ran to his parents, who made a choice that sealed all of their fates. Gerald, already suspicious of law enforcement due to his own record, convinced his son that no one would believe it was an accident. They dug the shallow grave before dawn, less than 30 yards from the swing set. Eli's own words described the rest. "I wanted to tell them," he said in his statement. "Every time they came back looking, every time I saw her mother crying on the news, I wanted to say something. But Dad said it would destroy us all. He said if I confessed, it would kill Mom too." When those words were read aloud in court, the silence was absolute. For 2 decades, the Cains had blamed each other, their marriage collapsing under the strain of suspicion. Derek had believed Melissa must have turned away too long. Melissa had believed Derek's absence that night meant he'd done something unforgivable. And now, in that moment, they both understood that the real truth had been just a few yards beyond that motel fence all along. The defense rested after 3 days of testimony. Eli didn't testify in his own defense, though his attorney read a letter he'd written to the Cain family. It was brief, more a plea for forgiveness than an explanation. "I can't ask you to forgive me," it said, "but I wanted you to know she wasn't alone. I stayed with her. I prayed she'd wake up." It didn't help him. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on both counts. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in state prison light by most standards, but the law could only punish what it could define. What it couldn't measure was the 22 years lost, the countless nights of unanswered questions, or the damage left in silence. When the verdict was read, Melissa wept quietly. Derek put his hand on her shoulder, not out of forgiveness but out of recognition. They had both been trapped in the same nightmare for half their lives, and now that it was over, neither seemed to know what to do next. Eli didn't look at them as he was led away. He lowered his head and whispered something the microphones didn't catch. Afterward, the press flooded the courthouse steps. News anchors described it as a long-awaited resolution to one of Alabama's most haunting cold cases. But for the people who'd lived through it, the word resolution felt wrong. There was no relief, only the weight of understanding how small the truth really was compared to the years of grief it left behind. In the weeks that followed, Melissa returned to Alabama one final time. The motel had been demolished years earlier, the land overtaken by weeds. The playground was gone, the gravel lot erased by time, but she still knew where it had been. She brought with her a small white box containing a child's swing she'd bought at a thrift store. She tied it to the branch of a lone pine tree at the edge of the property. The rope creaked softly in the wind. She stayed there for a long time, staring at the spot where the swing moved back and forth just as it had the last time. She'd seen her daughter. For the first time in years, she didn't cry. She just whispered her daughter's name and left the swing swaying behind her. The official closing of the case came that same month. The sheriff read the statement aloud to the press. "The disappearance of Alyssa Cain has been resolved. The cause of death has been ruled accidental, and responsible parties have been held accountable." But those who had been there, the searchers, the officers, the townspeople knew that the story didn't end neatly. It wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about what silence can do to people when they let it live for too long. Years later, when asked about the case, one retired detective said something that stuck. "People always imagine monsters," she said. "They think evil wears a face or drives up in a van. But sometimes, the monsters aren't who we imagine. They're the ones who stay quiet, who make a choice to look away." And in the quiet woods, off Highway 41, where the motel once stood, the wind still carried the faint sound of rustling chains, the echo of a swing that once moved under the weight of a child who was never meant to vanish at all.